Welcome back to another episode of the Higher Love with Megan podcast, talking all things mind, body, soul, healing and expansion with me, your host, Megan Cooper. If you are returning to this space, please do take a moment to rate the show, or you can head over to Apple Podcasts to leave a review, all of which enables more people to find me and for me to connect with more great guests each week for both yours and my enjoyment. If you're new here, welcome, and it's great to connect, celebrating you for dedicating your time to self-discovery and reconnection. Our time is our greatest commodity and gift, so thanks for investing it in yourself and sharing it with me. Up on the podcast this week, we have the fabulous Naomi Gale. Naomi Gale is a vaginologist, educator, guide, speaker, and content creator. Naomi is a highly qualified, nervous system-led, somatic-focused root healing mentor, guiding people back to connection with their wombs, vaginas, and vulvas. As a former classroom-based teacher, Naomi educates with ease, making everything accessible. Her primary focus is on people learning the tools needed to live a more rooted, nervous system-led life. Naomi's work has been featured widely, from BBC podcasts to sex-positive influencers' YouTube channels to articles in Cosmopolitan and elsewhere. I stumbled across Naomi's work fairly recently when I saw clips from her book launch for her book, In Your Vagina Lies the Keys to Your Happiness. I was immediately magnetised to her message. I love women educating on these topics. I immediately loved her vibe, read pretty much every single one of her posts, and immediately invited her onto the podcast. Selfishly, so I would get to hang out with her, but secondly, because I know this would be such an incredible conversation to share. One that would educate, inform, inspire, and empower so many women listening, and I trust and hope that it does exactly that. Thank you so much, Naomi, for being here. I'm really, really grateful for you spending your time and energy with us, and really excited to hear all of your wisdom. So thank you.
Oh, thank you for having me, Megan. It's an absolute pleasure. Can't wait.
Okay, so your book, In Your Vagina Lies the Keys to Your Happiness, and your work, what is it about?
This is a great question. I mean, how long would you like for the astounding? The whole premise of my work is about us coming back into relationship with our pelvis, but I use anatomical terms like vagina, vulva, to ensure that everybody is engaging, first of all, with the anatomical terms, but also because I feel that that moves through shame. So I see myself as really the person that people would come to for more support with perhaps physical challenges, like there might be pain or there may be emotional pain, physical pain, but also to start moving through the shame that may be held overall, not just from experiences. There may be trauma, there may be challenge, there may be, these experiences that we've moved through, but also there's a patriarchal shame that exists with the pelvis. So the whole point of my work and the book is to start moving that shame through society overall, and through people who are reading and engaging in the work, if that makes sense.
Yeah, beautiful. Thank you so much. And you describe the book as a fuck you to the system that continues to suppress. So can you expand on that?
Yeah, so in the book, I do a long explanation of how we've been shut down in society. What I see in society overall is this complete and utter shutdown of the pelvis, so much so that if someone asks me what I do, either they engage in the conversation with open ears and eyes, and they're like, oh my gosh, like this is fascinating, or they completely retreat back into their bodies and into themselves, and they like shut down the conversation. And what I see every time I open up the conversation is such a mixed bag of opinions and feelings and narratives. So the system continues to bind through a variety of narratives. So it could be through the fact that we can go into a supermarket and it's still called sanitary wear, right? And I'm like, well, sanitary means to be clean. So you're saying that we're dirty when we bleed? Or the system in general, like on social media, for example, we're banned on social media for using anatomical terms. And people will be like, you're not banned, but it's like, well, you'll put red flags on my account because I use the word vagina. And it's only places like this where we can talk freely with language like this that I'm not shut down. Even when I like send an email, my own email will go in my own junk because I've used anatomical terms, you know? So what I see is the book and my work as a bit of a fuck you to the system that binds and that continues to suppress and continues to put shame and around everybody's basically their body autonomy, their right to speak up for themselves and their needs and to educate themselves and to learn about what it is that they need and what they can do to support themselves. That is completely and utterly removed, and it's removed through so many sources, such as it's not great education at school really in general. It might be getting slightly better, but I wouldn't say it's that great anyway. Or through to the way that we can't access the education that we need on social media because we're banning accounts that are educating, you know. So where do we go? And then in the, you know, in doctors, for example, they're not trained in gynae. They can be literally go through the whole system and get to become a doctor and not have really any gynae training. So yeah, so it's a fuck you. All of that.
No, I love that. And in the book, you mention quite a bit around how this manifests within the medical system. And that was obviously a big part of your journey into this work. So could you expand a little bit on that and how this exists within the medical system and what you experienced and how that got you here?
Yeah, so when I was 17, I had painful periods to the point where they were so debilitating that when I went to the doctor, they just put me on the pill straight away. And now we know that the pill shuts down the cycle. Obviously, I say now we know, we should know, but we don't know because that's not how it's ever really been explained to us. So the pill shuts down the cycle, and when the cycle's maturing, so when the HPO axis is maturing, so the hypothalamus, the pituitary glands, and the ovaries, they have to mature. So they have to be able to have what I would call like their monthly dance off, right? And it doesn't mature until we're 21. So if we're shutting down our cycles before 21, and this might feel quite triggering, especially if you're perhaps listening to this and you're on the pill. I'm just saying I might be quite damning about the pill, but everyone has a choice. And it's, for me, this work is about being informed. So we can make better choices and good choices and the choices that we want to make for ourselves. And we feel are good and we feel are better choices. So if I was shut down before 17, then obviously I didn't fully understand my cycle and my rhythm. Then when I went to conceive later on, I had infertility challenges, but it was with my husband, not really with myself. But the thing was that when I came off the pill a few years later, you know, my late 20s, those period pains came back. So when I was trying to manage them, I was trying to manage period pains where I was like literally in the staff room. I was a teacher at the time. I was in the staff room and I couldn't actually take my own register because it was so bad. But I also obviously couldn't say, hey, I've come off my pill, so I'm trying to conceive. So like overall, you know, I was like, where do I go? Where do I turn? And the doctors were as useless as they were when I was 17. But when I was going through IVF, the main doctor, she said, oh darling, do you have painful periods? And I was like, oh, that's funny, no one's ever asked me that before. But the way that my clinic, so I had fertility treatment abroad in Athens, and they were very holistic in their view. So they would say things to me that I've never heard anyone say to me in the UK. And I am quite damning of the UK system, and I think rightly so, to be honest. She said that basically when I give birth, then everything would be better. She's like, oh, don't worry, darling, it'll be better. I've given birth vaginally to my son, and he was an 8-pound 4 baby, and vaginally to my twins, and who were almost 7 pounds each. So I had a fair few watermelons coming through. Do you know what I mean? And I ended up like still with major period pains after I gave birth, when my periods came back about 2 years into breastfeeding my twins. They were so bad, they were debilitating again. And I also ended up with ovulation pains every month. And I was like, shit me, I'm having ovulation pains and period pains. Do you know what I mean? Like, I've got no let up. And so when I went back to the doctor, he said the same thing that he'd said when I was 17. Well, you're not going to help you need to help yourself, so go on the pill. And I was thinking, you can't be serious. You can't tell me that I'm now early 30s and you're giving the same advice that you were giving me when I was 17. That's mad. So I thought, you know, I just felt like as well within my IVF process in the UK, I was gaslit consistently gaslit. And it wasn't about me, it was the fact that my husband had a zoospermia. It doesn't have a single sperm, so actually all I needed was some sperm. But it got to the point where I was like, is this really all I need? It's just sperm, because you're telling me like to put weight on and all this shit. And I was like, what the hell? And like the whole system to me was just, in my eyes, just like broken. I was like, this is a broken system. And a postcode lottery and your exemptions to those who can have IVF under NHS is bullshit. And like, just there's so much to it. And then I just realized that when I started training in some of the modalities that I work with now, that I was meeting people who had gone through, and no one's journey is worse or whatever, but to me, I was listening to them going, oh my gosh, this is worse than I've been through. That's how my initial response was, or meeting some of the women who I'd met in Athens. There's a lot of British women there and Irish women that I met, and their journeys were like just insane. I'd been going on that journey for like 9 months, ironically, at that point, to get to Athens. But these journeys were like 10, 15, 20 years of trying to conceive, and like hearing their pain and their challenge. And I was thinking, yeah, like there's just so much here. And then when I did my research for the book, I interviewed a friend's son who's been through doctor training. And I knew that he would be quite good at being interviewed about it, because he didn't have the best time for various reasons I won't go into. But I was pretty shocked by the training for doctors. His stories are actually really quite horrific. And I'm sure it's not everyone's experience, but his was awful. And when I interviewed him, I was asking him specifically about gynae and obstetric training, and to find out that you can literally go through the system and they're not enforcing gynae obstetric training. It's not in exams. It's not a yes, you have to go to that lecture. To find that out, so I basically said to him outright in the chat, I was like, so you're telling me that a doctor could get into that position of being a doctor with very little or maybe no gynae training, really? And he was like, yeah. And that's your first port of call when you're challenged with something. So that's kind of my experience. And then and what's continuously reaffirmed to me again and again and again. And the system obviously doesn't take into account emotional holding in the body. And I feel like this is a massive missing piece with the pelvis. The emotional holding pattern in the body has to be taken into consideration in every given situation for us to be able to really understand truly what's going on in the body. And when I meet people who have been through the NHS with support, or meeting consultants with support, and whether they've been privately or NHS, it's always about pain management rather than looking at the root cause of what it is in the first place. So that's a problem.
Yeah. And how do you think that we've got here, to this point of, again, it's a huge question, but how do you feel like we've got here to this lack of education, it not really being present in the medical system? Like, how is this system being upheld, would you say?
It's a really good question, because if you look back at like the ancient times, we were revered for being bleeding, like we're putting red tents, and we all we know this information now. There's plenty of us that are aware of that. So I don't know how we've gone from like revering people with pelvises and bleeding and all this like amazing information that we were getting at that point, and about just generally being cyclical. And I don't know how we've gone from that to this very heavily masculine oppressive approach to pelvic health. I would say, if you were asking me, Megan, you see, the way I kind of view it is that I see those who bleed, I see us as having like a lot of power, a lot of knowing, and a lot of when I see like someone leave my space like empowered with that, like, oh, I can do what I need to do energy, I'm like, God, there's no stopping them, and I'm like in awe. And that's like why I love like one-to-one work, because like having that relationship and then seeing them move into this power through understanding what they need through their pelvis is like, oh my gosh, this is such a gift to witness. So what I sort of feel like is that those who men over the time who can't bleed and can't shed and can't do all and don't have that power that perhaps I feel some of us have. This will piss people off, but I kind of feel like it's that shutdown that's continuously happened. The powers that be have continuously shut that down and have deemed it to be not important. And I could give so many examples of how this kind of continues to manifest, or how this continues to show itself. But like how women's health, like the research of women's health, is so shit. It's so awful, to the point where I wrote about this in the book. And the COVID vaccine, for example, they brought it all out, and we were all trying to get and scramble information from social media about whether or whether not to have it if, for example, you were trying to conceive a child, because they didn't bring it out with like, let's clarify everything that's going to happen here, and we've definitely understood like how this interacts with the menstrual cycle, and we definitely understand how this interacts with conception and pregnancy. It was a shit show. It was a shit show. And so for me, I'm like, well, I see how this continuously keeps repeating itself, the same pattern again and again and again. And what it does is it puts us into a position where we do not trust. On the whole, people don't trust the system. So then they don't go to the doctors with whatever it is that's coming up, because they just know that they're either going to be gaslit, ignored, downplayed. So then I feel like there's just the manifestations get worse and more challenging over the years, because people don't know where to turn for help, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. And you've seen this play out on social media as well, haven't you? Experiencing being shadow banned and cancelled and things, whereas there's probably a lot of other information available to men, which is inflammatory, which is not cancelled. So could you talk a little to that, how you see that play out in social media too?
Yeah, so it's a really good question, because this kind of mirrors what I'm saying. So just in case it's like, no, because sometimes I get that, they're like, you're talking shit, David. What happened was I went viral on TikTok, and so my work was really empowering a lot of people, and I had no idea like that the way because I kind of see myself as a really good middle ground to this work. I don't talk too spiritually, but I am spiritual, versus I'm not too medical, because that is obviously my background anyway. I'm holistic in the way in my training. I'm not a doctor, I'm not a gynecologist, but the way I view it is that I'm actually quite glad that I can kind of be a bit more neutral and middle ground with it. So when I was on social media, I was my yoga mentor at the time, and she was like, you'd be great on TikTok, babe. Go on TikTok. So I've been on there for like 10 days. I shared this video, and then it went viral. And I don't mean like a little bit viral. I mean, it went very viral, to the point where I was getting duetted with. So if anyone isn't aware, like on TikTok, people can duet. I think you can do that now on Instagram, but where you would like duet with people. But it was a big thing on TikTok with like, imagine like those people who were doing like the song parodies and that kind of thing. But this was happening with me going, the key to your success lies in your vagina. If I hear myself say that any more times in my lifetime, I literally might like dissolve. So literally everyone would like do that bit of my video, and then they would find keys. They would be like started this weird trend, and they would find keys from their like pelvic area and be like, oh my god, found them. And then what happened was this would like play out, and it hit massive influencers, and it hit them, and then they would share the video, and then that video was hitting like 6 million people. I was like looking at these views like of these other videos, and I was being duetted with like 20-30 times a day, like for like about a month. It was insane. And then it hit Instagram, and I was like, well, you've made it when something comes off TikTok and then hits Instagram. And some of the big influencers on there, not that they always tag me, of course, people would just send it to me and go, have you seen this? And then at the same time, TikTok suddenly went, wait a minute, who is this talking about the vagina? And then basically my videos went from like repeatedly hitting, not that I think that this should happen, and yes, TikTok's landscape has changed quite a lot, because now my videos might hit 200 people, but I still think that links to the fact that they started putting red flags on my account. They would say the videos would be like being reviewed, they were being like I'd send them, and then they would process them, as they always do, because obviously video gets processed, but then they would go into review, and they would just sit there on like 0 views, sometimes for up to 24 hours, and then someone would review it. But like, even if I shared a picture of the blue sky, it was being reviewed. But at the same time of me being reviewed, and I was hitting a lot of young people, I was having DMs, so many DMs going like, oh my gosh, thank you so much for this, like this video has really helped me with this. And I was getting so much like obviously feedback as well, with support, not just the joke. side of it. But Andrew Tate, for example, which we all are aware of now, who's now recently been done for all this work, like, you know, sexual awfulness that he's been part of, he was like creating this like whole movement of young, mainly men who were saying horrible awful things about how to treat women. And like, you know, he was a misogynist of misogynists. He was like dubbed the king of misogyny, and they were not shutting him down in any which way, shape, or form. At the same time, me empowering, you know, the feminine was being shut down. And then what happened was that they started, there was a video, if no one knows how it actually happened, where he kind of got, if no one's aware of what that narrative was, but basically there was a very influential YouTube person who wouldn't normally share this kind of thing. I think he was more of a gamer, really, and he basically did a whole video on how awful Andrew Tate was. And what he was seeing was young people coming through on his page, and it was dangerous, very, very dangerous. I'm there talking about rape and rape stats and the importance of consent in society, and then Mr. Misogynist over there is saying, like, that basically use the words of, if a woman gets raped, that's her fault, right? I'm being shut down. He ain't. And then this guy on YouTube was like, this needs to stop. He needs to stop. Someone needs to remove him. Then the social media accounts looked into it. He was removed from Twitter. He was removed from Instagram. But incidentally, where I was being the most shut down was TikTok. He was not removed from TikTok for another 24 hours after the rest of them around that time, because they were investigating whether his videos were bad. Meanwhile, you're reviewing mine before they even go out. So we all know it. That's what was happening at the time, and literally right at the time of me being shut down. So it's a really good real life example of the challenge that we're still facing.
Yeah. And you talk about this a little bit in the book. Is this like continuation of the witch wound, right?
Yeah.
Could you talk a little bit about the witch wound? Because it's a topic that I love too.
The witch wound, I mean, Nicola Sturgeon, was it 2022, was it? Yes, last year, apologized for the witch wound. Never really been outwardly talked about, but the witch wound essentially was where people were being hanged for basically talking about what we talk about now, Megan. As an we would be open hanged, we're fucked.
Oh yeah. Mega fucked.
But it's basically like that they were going around hanging anyone who would agree with anyone else about basically having autonomy over the bodies, essentially, is what it was. But they were basically saying that they were witches, right? And that they were doing like some weird ass shit and we should hang them for it. And it was Scotland, where it was one of the worst places, and they hanged thousands of people. We're not talking like a few, we're talking like thousands of mainly women were being hanged. And no one talks about this. No one, it's not really, I mean, saying no one, I mean, we do talk about it. I mean, we talk about it. And spiritual spaces tend to talk about it. But generally, this is just something that's kind of disappeared and gone under the radar. So we know it has, because Nicola Sturgeon literally had to apologize on International Women's Day in 2022. 2022, this was years ago. So then what I see is that the witch wound continues in other forms. So it's like, okay, well, because nothing really bad happened as a result, and that those laws that were in place around the witch wound continue to be in place for years after, until quite recently. Some of the laws around the witch wound and the witches and the hanging of the witches, I can't remember specifically what they were, but when I was researching the book, it actually blew my mind, like some of the legislation that continued on in the Houses of Parliament until very recently. And so what I see is like, okay, we're not going around hanging people, because that obviously isn't acceptable. But what we're going to do is we're going to shut people down on social media instead, and like ensure that it's shut down through the anatomical language. And so I made a joke, because, you know, Threads came out, i.e. like Instagram's Twitter, if you haven't found that yet, that hoo-ha. And then I went on there and I was like, just as a joke, I was like, oh, can I use cunt, vulva and vagina on this one? And then it was like, straight away I was like, this is inappropriate language. I was like, what, already so soon? You've only been up for like a few hours. You know, so they was like, what have you done? Like, gone and programmed it? What have you done? Like, programmed it so like anyone that uses this, that's inappropriate. I don't understand. Like, so that's how I kind of see it, because it's just anatomical terms.
Yeah.
You know.
What did your healing journey look like with your vagina?
That's a great question. Well, I've never been able to hold a wee in, really, until done this work. So I used to wee myself as a child. I would have a wee, and then I would always be like, oh, a little bit of wee would still come out, like after I'd been to the toilet, or I'd have to keep going back to the toilet because there was more wee that wanted to come out. And now I look back and I realize that it's basically all my pelvic floor holding. And so I had a lot of trauma as a child. I was hit as a child and emotionally abused as a child. And so basically that must have just, and I used to wee myself when I was being hit. So obviously that's all like the trauma that's linked in with that. And then when I had my son, they gave me an episiotomy. Mainly they said I needed it. I mean, obviously I wish now I voiced that I didn't want it, because what I've learned and I've seen with a lot of clients is that episiotomy healing is a lot worse than a tear healing. But they were like, oh, you're going to tear. And I actually would have rather have teared than had the episiotomy. But he was coming out with his hand around his face. So he's like little
like, cute for him, less cute for you.
Yeah. Yeah, super cute though, but if we could have just avoided that. So yeah, and they forceps him. So the episiotomy was so painful and the healing of it was so awful, and sex was so weird. It was weird. Like my husband's penis didn't feel the same. It was weird, and like sex wasn't enjoyable, and it was just, oh, it was horrible really. And the pelvic floor didn't get any better, obviously from that. And then I went through myself back into an IVF journey. So pissing myself was the last of my concerns, really, Megan, at that point of my journey. But then when I had my twins, basically they took the catheter out and didn't tell me, because I had epidural, because with twins they just get very heavily involved. I stood up and I just gushed. I mean, I must have peed like as much as like a racehorse all over the floor of this space, right? And I wasn't mortified because of what I'd just been through, but if I hadn't just been through that, I would have been absolutely mortified. But B, this midwife just stood there and she went, well, you've got pelvic floor to work on. And at the time, I remember her saying that, and I was thinking, yeah, babe, but you know, this isn't a matter of me just giving birth now. I've always had this sort of issue. And then I couldn't hold in a shit. So you don't want to shit yourself, do you, Megan? Do you know what I mean? No. That's like a whole thing. Weeing yourself, it's like a little bit of wee comes out, you're like fair, but full poo.
Highly inconvenient.
I literally have been in the middle of that Brighton, you know, in the middle of Brighton's like shopping centre, and I've just stood there.
Churchill Square.
Yeah, and been like, it's happening, and like running to that like one toilet like near what was Debenhams or that area, just been like go in, and like my husband just left with the 3 children, and he's like, got you, yeah, you do you. And it's like, so I can't live like that. And then I basically dived obviously into all this work, and I was getting more of a connection with my pelvis like through womb work, and I was like, oh my gosh, like this is amazing. And I was really starting to on this like really deep healing journey for myself through all the trauma. And then kind of what happened was I landed on Tammy's work, Tammy Lynn Kent's work, as a result of another course, a breathwork course I was doing, a circular breathwork course. And they were like, this is part of your reading. And I read it and I cried after I read her book, Wild Feminine. I love it so much. I feel like you have to have gone on some level of spiritual journey to follow her threads a little bit, but I adore the book. I adore her crone energy. And she was coming to London to do some training, and I'd engaged with the book and the book's exercises to a point, of course, like you can only get so far, but actually working with her through training, that's where it was pivotal for me. And now I know if and now like my connection with my vagina and genuinely just like pleasure during sex, and actually my connection with my clitoris is like a whole new level as well of doing this work, which is a beautiful, like for me, what I see as a side effect of actually what was a very physical challenge. You'll be pleased to know, Megan, and listeners will be pleased to know that I no longer shit myself. I also am aware when I need to come back to connection. I'm aware of when my nervous system is very dysregulated, then I lose connection with my body, I lose connection with my pelvis, I lose connection with that pelvic floor. And then I come back into ritual and ceremony and massage, touch, and the fascia release. And then I'm able to continue on with my journey, if that makes sense. So I didn't do the squeezy app. I didn't do any Kegels that everyone tells you should do. That isn't the way that I believe is the way. But as a result of doing this work, I've really like had such a a transformation, I would say, from myself over my overall body, but that kind of like general worry of weeing and pooing myself is no longer.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
So for people listening who are new to this work, how does it feel to be connected or disconnected from our body or vagina? Because somebody listening might be like, well, I think that I feel quite connected, but actually they haven't done any of this work and maybe they don't even know that they're disconnected. So how does it feel to be connected or disconnected from our body or vagina?
That's a really great question. I would say, like, I mean, if you're listening to this and you're feeling a deep connection, then that's amazing. But I see there's like various connections, right? We could be sexually connected to ourselves, and that isn't really the focus of my work. I kind of see, I'm not saying that sexually connecting to myself is bypassing. That's not what I'm saying. But there is a level of potential bypassing if we're just working on how can I get the orgasm, or how can I be with orgasm, or when I go to self-pleasure, it's all about climaxing. Because I kind of see like the climax as the climax, and then there's always the fall down. Do you know what I mean? It's the come down, which is, it's great to get there, but then when you're there, that's it, and then there's a drop down. And it's a little bit like, when we have the alcohol fix or drug fix. That's kind of the way I view it. I'm not dissing it, because I bloody love an orgasm, Megan, but I'm saying that we need to be aware of like, what does that, when we say we're connected, is it just a sexual, or is it just like I'm really great in like just having a great orgasm, because it's more to it. So that's one level of connection I see people say they have. And I'm like, okay, but what if I started talking about connecting in through ceremony and ritual and being present with kind of any feelings that can come up with connecting in with the pelvis? What if I said to you to write a vagina timeline, a vulva timeline, and you go along this whole timeline and you write down all your experiences and anything that's coming up? How would that feel for you? What would come up for you overall? What's the overarching theme for you? Because if it's the overarching theme of, oh, I didn't really think about how poor my first bleed was, for example, or I didn't really think about that sexual experience that I had when I was drunk when I was 19, and I've not been able to go there, but now I think about it, my body is kind of like contracting a little bit, then what I'm saying is that there's still work to be done. And I would say, Megan, that I haven't met anyone really, unless you've deep dive, and I mean specifically deep dive with your pelvis in this way, and you've definitely done work with the vagina. I wouldn't say there's anyone that would sit here and listening to this and say, oh yeah, I'm great, I'm really connected. Because I see, even for myself, I do the work, that's what's important for me, and I see that there's still so much work for me to do. So what I would say is that you can have a connection, but it depends on what the layers are with that connection. So if you're thinking, okay, well, sexually I'm disconnected, there may be that. It may be that you don't feel like you can enjoy sex, or maybe you can't enjoy one night stands or enjoy being with your partner. There can be a level of that. It could be that you absolutely don't want to bleed, like that blood ain't coming anywhere near me. There can be that level of disconnect. It could be a disconnect with conception and being like, I'm trying to conceive, but I don't know what conception really looks like for me, or I don't really truly understand my cycle. I've got the app, but I don't really understand the app, or don't really fully understand. I know where I'm on day one, but I've been having sex like, I mean, when a client comes to me and they've said they've had sex like 8 or 9 times before they've even ovulated, I'm like, I don't know how you're still standing. You're not exhausted by like having to commit to that, both of you. But B, there's like such a level of misunderstanding around how to conceive and actually how the body works. And so there's that. Or just a general lack of education around how the body works, like how your cycles are, like how you're seasonal, how you can work with your seasons and your hormones, and being aware of what your discharge is even, and like how your discharge works, because discharge is such a gift. and we can learn so much from it. And that shut down in society, you know, some of us wear panty liners every day because we don't want to feel wet. We want to feel dry and almost clean, because that's the sanitary term that we hear, and that's instilled in us. Even if you're like you're washing with like washes, like fem washes, I would question about that. That could be like a disconnect that you're subconsciously not aware of, because we're told to be clean. There's adverts for it. Do you know what I mean? So of course, you know, we're going to go out, potentially buy it. I mean, there are even more holistic companies that are selling that, and I'm still not sure about that. I'm like, yeah, it's kind of organic, isn't it? But then I'm still like, but do I really need it to smell like peppermint? I'm not sure I do. So, you know, it's those sort of layers. Does that answer the question, Megan? I don't know if I'm answering.
No, it does absolutely. You've mentioned a few different, you know, tools and practices and rituals, and I know that sometimes for people coming into a new area of their healing, it can feel a bit overwhelming and like, oh God, like, where do I start? Do I need to do everything? You know, like, how do I even know which bit to begin with? How would you say to begin on the first steps of this kind of journey of reconnection?
Yeah, it's a really great one, because it can feel overwhelming. And I think we also can approach this as very much like, I'm going to do everything and everything's going to be fine. And actually we're not ready for that, really. If we think about the layers that we're working with, there's a lot there, and we have to be really gentle with ourselves. So for example, like if I deliver a workshop or a talk, or maybe if you're even listening to this, you might notice in your body some tension or some challenge. And so just to be aware of how triggering at times this can be. And even the word vagina, I was chatting to a friend of mine on the beach. She has a little girl, and she was like, you know, I'm all right with vulva. I use vulva with her. Oh, but the word vagina, oh, even just like saying it now, like, oh, it's too much, you know? So I'm like, so you wouldn't use the word cunt then? And she was like, oh my God, you know? And so it's like just being aware that there's a lot to it, and that it's not just from your own trauma or challenge. As I said at the beginning, it's from society in general. There's a lot to unpick. So my first thing I would say to people is that if you've not done any cyclical awareness at all, or any diving into that, you know, if you've never read like Period Power with Maisie Hill or any of those things, then I would say a really good starting point would be just to start tuning in to what's coming up in the body every day for a bit in a journal, and just being like, oh, okay, that's interesting. Like, I'm on day 18, and that day has been really challenging, but there was no real reason for it being challenging. So I'm wondering why that might be. Oh, actually, if I understood my cycle now, I can see that progesterone is rising, and progesterone can bring about challenge because it's pulling me deeper into the body, whereas estrogen is that outward, more of an exciting hormone. It gets me going. But actually, I'm confused because I should technically be in my summer season, when summer is this like outward time, but I'm actually feeling really inward. Why is that? And starting to make these questions, starting to make these connections, and then kind of tuning into seasons overall and being like, okay, well, the more I dive into this, the more I can do this like over 3 months, you know, so writing every 3 months, and then have it all out in front of you and flick back and see those challenging days and see if they mirror month to month, and then wondering, I wonder why that is. Oh, maybe I just do find my summer season a little bit challenging, and the progesterone pulls me into my body a little bit, and I actually want to cocoon more in my body. And what would that look like for me? And I think that the question I always give clients is like, what do you need? What do you need at any time? Always, what is it that you need right now? And so giving them that space to kind of explore that. And then you could then as well, within those days, just explore discharge. So if you're on contraception, you could still do that and just see if there's any discharge as well. But it's when you're exploring discharge, and the reason I do this, and the reason I get people to check in with their discharge, which seems such a basic thing to do, or something that you might be like, that's just a weird thing that Naomi is on about. But actually what you're doing is you're connecting with your pelvis in such a deep way that you're not really aware. You're subconsciously connecting in with your whole area, right? You're connecting in with how your body is moving cyclically month to month. You're connecting in with a discharge. It's literally leaving your vagina. So you're connecting in with your vagina in this way. And basically it's got like cilia hairs that are like in the nose, and it moves the mucus discharge down, just like when you've got a cold, right? And so what society's done is gone, discharge, gross, and you're going, oh yeah, I'm gross. But actually, if you go, oh my gosh, there's cilia hairs moving my discharge down, and I'm connecting in with like how much discharge is there. And actually, if I explored discharge, I'd be aware that there's like times when it's sticky and it's like really like not the same as it is when it's like wet. And it's like when it's wet, it's allowing the sperm, it's feeding the sperm with fructose, and it's nourishing the sperm, and it's allowing the sperm to live for longer. And when it's scant and it's together under the microscope, the actual lanes of the discharge are like webs, and they prevent the sperm from moving any further, and they actually kill the sperm off. Whoa, I'm amazing, right? And so if we could tune in to like every single day with that just for 3 months, I wonder where that conversation would go for you, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. And what was coming up for me there was, it feels like a lot of this work kind of moves from shame to normalizing to celebrating. Because what was coming up, and I was thinking of, thoughts that I've had in the past of around discharge. I remember thinking, when I was younger, that I must be weird because I must be the only person who has this, and like how embarrassing it is. And like, you don't want like people to see your pants or like anything like that. But actually recognizing that that's normal, a lot of this stuff. And that's then really cool that my body does this. And like, that's something that we should be celebrating. So like, that feels for me, like energetically, like the arc of doing this work, like shame, normalizing, celebrating. Would you say?
Yeah, 100%. Like if you look at the themes of consciousness, shame's the bottom one, right? So moving through shame is so hard. And what I see often happens is that, that normalization often comes with anger. Like there's so much anger that can come up in this space. Angry, even if you're listening to this now and you're like, oh, I never knew that. And then you get angry about it. You're like, why did no one ever tell me this? Or like when you're trying to conceive, why did nobody tell me the egg was actually only receptive to sperm for 10 hours and I shut down my cycle for 22 years? Do you know what I mean? And it's like that level of anger and frustration. And then we're normalizing the conversation, like you say. And then we move through that anger, because we can always work with anger, can't we? And then we're like, oh my God, this is so cool. I'm celebrating myself and everyone else. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely. And I know as well that when I first read Wild Power by Alexandra Pope and Shani Hugo Wurlitzer, when I read that years ago, it was life-changing, like absolutely life-changing. Like I didn't know that I was supposed to be different every day. I didn't know that I was allowed to give myself permission to be different every day. That for me was like a huge life shift. So I'm really glad that you brought that in as kind of an initial step, because I know the power of all other women that have experienced that. What other tools and practices have helped you or your clients? And I know there's lots. You've mentioned rituals and ceremonies and womb work. So maybe you could speak a little bit to those things and expand.
Yeah, I think one of the things I find really life-changing for myself as somebody who has dealt with a lot of anxiety over the years is really being aware of my nervous system and how my nervous system kind of pendulums. And what that looks like for us day to day is being in that like fight or flight, being in the dorsal freeze response, which I bloody love living in. I've learned like I can freeze and lose myself like that. It's getting much less over the years, but I am like, my inner protectors will come in and be like, you're useless, you're not worthy, and like I can hear them, and they'll get louder and louder and louder the more dysregulated I am. And then right. And then being in the parasympathetic, like living life and being like, oh my gosh, this is so great, everything's so great. We don't want to be in the parasympathetic all the time, because that's just not right either. We want to feel that pendulum shift. So what I've really had to sit with was, I lacked mothering growing up, and I believe that a lot of us did. We can have the most phenomenal mothers and still feel like we lack mothering, maybe past that age of like being in our 20s and not have mothered ourselves. So what I kind of see with this like nervous system work is how we can mother ourselves with that pendulum swinging nervous system. And so what I kind of love clients, and I love to do for myself, is see where I sit within my day to day and what brings me out of it. And now I work with my specific tools that I enjoy working with and I've explored over the years, it's like, okay, what is it that comes back to that question, what is it that I need today? And then being like, where am I today? I feel a bit frantic. I'm probably in fight or flight. I'm actually feeling like I'm in that cocooning freeze response and I just don't know what to do with myself or where to go. Or actually, I'm feeling really good today. I feel very parasympathetic. So it's like, okay, how can I keep myself in that parasympathetic state? That's where I want to be today. How can I move myself out of that fight or flight? How can I move myself from the freeze response? And how can I do that through the ceremony and ritual that I'm used to bringing in for myself? And when people think about ceremony and ritual, Megan, I want people to be aware that this can be as basic as making yourself a cup of tea and actually drinking it hot or warm and sitting with it, right? Because I think we often will get to the point where, and I did a Vipassana course last year, 10-day one. And if anyone knows what that is, like where you sit in silence for 10 days, and it is genuinely sitting in silence for 10 days, and was way more extreme than I probably should have.
Yeah, I've done a silent retreat for 7 days a couple of times, and it's full on.
You're like, I'll be absolutely fine. I can't wait for the silence. No, it actually wasn't the silence. It was more just the fact that I was like, feel like I was in like, jail. Like, I need to get out. But in that time, I always think about when he said, Yogi Bhaji, what's his name? Bhaji. He said, don't just eat your breakfast on WhatsApp, be with your breakfast. And I was like, it's so true that I think that we often, oh no, that was in my yoga training. He said, don't eat breakfast with WhatsApp. And I was like, this is so true. And it was kind of what was mirrored in the Vipassana. It's like you're being with every single moment of your day with the sensations that are coming up, the feelings that are coming up, and being with that, even if you're at work, even if you're drinking a cup of tea, and it's being with that moment and feeling into the body at any given time, like what's coming up, what's triggering, what's challenging. And what I like to do in times when I'm feeling dysregulated, and generally just day to day, is like plug myself back into Mother Earth. And I think this is a tool that everyone can come to. It's where we send down a grounding cord into the earth below. We plug ourselves into Mother Earth's placenta, so to speak. We come back to being cyclical and in nature and reminding ourselves that, hey, look, she's in her summer and I'm actually also in my summer, or I'm in my winter. And what does that look like for me? And how can I resource through plugging myself into Mother Earth? And I think when we give ourselves this permission just for a moment to energetically and visually plug ourselves in through our pelvis, down from our womb, through our vaginas, down into Mother Earth below, and be like, oh my gosh, and just like, be fed from her, like held from her, by her, nourished by her for a moment. That gives me so much when it comes to like mothering myself. I feel mothered by Mother Earth, if that makes sense.
Yeah. That's beautiful. Thank you. What if you've been through a lot of sexual trauma or abuse? What would you say to that for somebody entering into this field of work who's carrying a lot? What would you say to that?
Yeah, so that's why I've had to really bolster myself with trauma work, because I don't think I underestimated the amount of sexual assault and rape that exists in society, but I certainly think I didn't expect to see so much of it in a space that I was creating. And what happened was the more I was working with clients, I have a very specific form that they fill out, and on there I will ask quite specifically and openly around sexual assault, child sexual assault, and rape. And what I've learned, Megan, over the years is that we are very, very confused as a society around rape. We're very, very confused what defines rape, and we're very, very confused about consent. And so even if somebody's listening to this, they may be thinking, well, I did go through this sexual experience, but it wasn't that bad. It wasn't that bad because I didn't leave with bruises or I wasn't beaten up. And that tends to be what society has depicted as what rape looks like. And this is obviously not the case. So what I say first and foremost is there's a very gentle landing into this kind of work through, first of all, we don't relive. I don't believe in reliving any experience. That's not where this is at. But it's the acknowledgement that that was shit. It's the acknowledgement that that happened and it was shit, and that happened to you. And I'm so sorry that happened. you know? And I think, and I get upset when I talk about it because I find it so upsetting to see like how much, and that's why I'm so passionate about this work, because there's so much of it. And I get upset because often what happens is in my spaces is that we have a little cry together, because actually they're not, these people that come to me, they tend not to have spoken about it at all to anybody else. They might have even gone through counseling but not felt they could bring it up, because they felt like it wasn't the space to do that. And I think that what happens is that we have to give everybody a moment to process and be with that actually happened. And then once we've had the space to discuss that, even just acknowledging it first and foremost, and then what happens is that we kind of are guided by what the body is ready for. And so when someone's been through that level of challenge, I always say, like, my book's amazing and it's there to normalize and it's there to educate and it's there to support, but don't feel like you have to go through that alone. So if you can find someone to support you, and even if that means coming to me for support and you feel ready to do that, then that for me is the most important thing, is being able to offer that one-to-one support. That's why I said I never not want to be able to offer that one-to-one support, because then someone can come to me and process with me, if and then we're guided. That's why I wrote the book, because for me, I love all the books that exist out there at the moment. I'm not dissing any book, that's not what I'm doing, but I'm saying that there's not enough trauma informed. And not that I love the term trauma informed, I think it's a bit loosey goosey, but I think there's not enough trauma awareness of rape and sexual assault within these books that are like, okay, now everybody open your thighs and look at your vulva in the eye, and you're like, I have been through actual rape and actual sexual assault, and there's no way that I can just be like, oh, here it is. And so that for me is a real problem that I see, and I think that we need to be aware that there are some steps to take before that, before we dive into that level of work and touch. That makes sense.
Yeah, and there's a lot of like gentleness involved with that journey, because that disconnection is the trauma, right? It's like when we become disconnected, you know, we have the traumatic incident, but then we have that disconnection within us, whether that's the disconnection from our bodies or our emotional capacity. So that journey can be very slow for people, and it can be, you know, very guided and very gentle. So I suppose that's just you know, an extra invitation that if someone's been through a lot, that it doesn't have to, that journey of healing doesn't have to look a certain way or go at a particular speed. That's kind of what I'm hearing from you as well, right?
Yeah, it takes a long time. Yeah. It depends on the person as to how quick or fast. It's the body. That's why it's so important to put the body somatically, to see what the body is ready.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. So how do rites of passage play a role in this work? You've mentioned menarche and how it's something that we don't really celebrate here. It's celebrated elsewhere. But I guess that's also involved with this kind of remothering process, that actually our relationship to our cycle is really impacted by where it started. And maybe then a little invitation to, if you are a mother with a daughter, then that's kind of just something to think about. So could you just talk about menarche?
Yeah. Menarche is your first ever bleed. And in society in general, we don't really talk about it. We might get thrown some, I mean, I remember my mum just throwing me some tampons, and I'm not being funny, but like, how do you insert one? It's not new. I mean, like when you were like that age, you're like, I don't know how to insert that. And we're not necessarily ready to insert a tampon. And so there's a lot of that. Or just, there's just a lot of amazing stories around the menarche that fascinate me, that then what happens is that kind of mirrors our feelings and approaches to our general pelvic health. It's like where the synapses form. This was my experience. Every time you bleed, it'll feel like it could be a similar experience because that trauma is there. It's like almost, I know it's not quite as extreme as that, but I mean, it definitely can be for some people. It's like going through a car crash every freaking month. Do you know what I mean? It's like, when I get in a car, is it going to crash? Oh, yeah, it did. That reaffirmed that it crashed. And then you're going to get in a car again. It's like, am I going to be in a car crash? And it's like, if you go through your bleed and it's extremely painful, or there is so much shame and it was very distressing, is that going to happen every time I bleed? Is it? and you're bracing. And that's a lot of this work, is the body is bracing for, when we're talking about assault, for example, it's like the brace position the whole time. So when menarche isn't great, we're bracing for a really shit bleed every month. And so some of us will be gifted with a really lovely open conversation experience, but a lot of us won't have. And in other societies, it's mixed, and obviously it's mixed within those societies. So there's a lot of celebration and awe. And there's also a lot of challenge in some religions around those who bleed. It's deemed that they're ready for marriage and children, and we've got to remember that these are children themselves. So what I see is, and I'm really passionate about, is us being able to just tune back into our first bleed. And I'm not saying we're going to relive it, but just being with it and exploring what happened and giving ourselves that moment. Because if we give ourselves a moment to explore that, then we can start to see what comes up month to month. And so if you're somebody that experiences really challenging period pains, what was your first period like? So for myself, it was extremely painful when I was lying on my psychology teacher's floor, right? And then it continued to be painful, and then I said, oh, it's painful after my children. And so it's just mirrored. The same thing was mirrored, and I'm constantly bracing myself for an awful bleed. Now when I bleed, I don't bleed with pain. There might be discomfort, and I'm very aware if I haven't honored myself enough in that cycle, and that's my body being like, you haven't honored yourself enough. This is why it's painful. Sit down, lie down, rest. You know what I mean? That's all that this siren is. And so now I can be so aware, and actually I love my bleed. I love it. But I'd had to move through so much trauma and challenge with my bleed in order to get to that point. And going through my first ever bleed was so much of a gift. So within the book, there's a menarche exploration, and there's you get a website link in the book, and you can go and listen to this visualization, and you can go back and explore what came up, and then see how you can move that through, so that you can move into more peace at the very least with what happened, basically.
Yeah, beautiful. Thank you. Okay, so a couple of last questions. How would you say your life is different now? So then versus now from doing this work.
Well, I was saying just before we started our call, so my son turns 7 tomorrow, incidentally, as we're recording, and he obviously was my first birth, and to go and to conceive him was a journey, and then to conceive the twins was a whole nother journey. But so essentially I would say that I've been doing this work at this level for about 7 years. And I was saying to you, wasn't I, that I was reflecting back with my journal today, thinking, gosh, yeah, I mean, he's 7, time flies when you have children, la la la. But I was also being like, oh my gosh, 7 years of this inner deep work, and I feel a very different person to then. And I think one of the biggest things, so my husband and I have been together for 12 years, and he might murder me if I've got that wrong. We could have been married for 12 years. I think we've been together for 12 years, and we're celebrating 10 years anniversary of marriage. Oh, be nine. This is great, Megan. Anyway, so we've been together for a long time, and within that relationship, he's always felt a level of shutdown from me over the years, right? So I protect myself, like I mentioned, dorsal is my favorite place to be. I protect myself from people by shutting down and shutting them out and keeping them at a very careful distance, because that protects me from just what I've experienced in the past, right? And so one day I said to him within my journey, I was like, I think I wrote about this in the book, and I said, do you feel like I experience joy? Do you think that I actually experience joy, or do you think I sit with joy? And he said to me, no, I don't think you do. And at the time I was so taken aback, I actually took my breath away, that he felt all those years of us being together that he didn't think that I allowed myself and us to be in joy, despite even at that point had been on quite a long journey. Might have been 4 years into this work, and despite the fact at that point, I think we'd moved to Margate, where I am now, and living this really on the outside, amazing life by the sea. I've got 3 children, there should be everything, right? Everything that I've ever wanted, but yet I still didn't allow myself to feel joy. And so then I went on a bit of a journey with that. And I think just being aware of where I'm at, like I was saying, emotionally, physically, and being present with myself, and just taking that time and that pause allows me to reflect on, am I really here and now, and experiencing the joy of here and now and the pleasure of that. And I talk about pleasure because pleasure is a beautiful byproduct of this work. Like I said, I don't talk about the orgasmic 90s Cameron Diaz pleasure. I'm talking about the pleasures of life, and our clitoris is connected with the pudendal nerve to the main nerve, the ventral wanderer nerve. And so that for me is like the seat of pleasure, and experience day-to-day pleasure, not the orgasmic pleasure, but pleasures of life. And so that's why I was saying, like, I feel like I'm more connected with my clitoris overall when I have sex, but I think like generally day to day I'm more connected with joy and pleasure. And that for me, and that then has been pivotal in our marriage, because I'm allowing more joy in and more pleasure, and that also has then it means that I can allow him in a little bit more. Not fully, Megan, I'm still on that journey, but he is definitely more present in my life. God bless him.
Oh, beautiful. How do you think society would be different if this work became mainstream culture? What do you think would be possible for us? We've talked a little bit individually, so collectively, what do you think could be possible as a result of doing this work individually?
I got three, as I say, I got three children, and my one goal, I talk about this when I do a talk, is like for the world to be a little bit more pussy led by the time they get to puberty. And now he's 7. I'm like, that's soon. So maybe I'm not going to get that fully, but I feel like if there's a few, I'll just share a couple of things that I would see that would be amazing. First of all, I feel like we would be a little bit more aware of where we are cyclically, and be more empowered with our choices of contraception. And we would be more empowered with like saying, hey, I'd love to have a one night stand with X, but actually I'm in my most fertile period right now, so probably wouldn't be best, without worrying about just relying on a condom, right? And I know this seems like such a small thing, but I think that's massive, because then what we have in this country is like one of the highest rates. I can't remember what the stat is, but it's like one of the highest rate of like teenage pregnancies in this country. And I think it's because we live in a society where we just don't have a bloody clue about how our bodies work and how how conception really works. And then the other thing I would see as this byproduct is a lot more consent in society, and teaching our children what consent looks like from the beginning. And I would like to think that that would then lower the rape stats, because in 2022 it was the highest number of ever recorded rape statistic in 2022, but the lowest, like the convictions remain the same. Sorry, I didn't really explain that properly, but yeah. So basically what I'm saying is that I think that if we understood consent, there's a really great study, Megan, where they were asking people to check in. They were saying, okay, if you were going into a sexual situation with somebody, and so this is where I see the real problem is, like, if you say yes at the beginning to having sex with somebody, right? How many times do you think you should be checking in during that sexual scenario? So like, if you're saying yes at the beginning, I want to have sex, and they have a clear yes, that's part of what we're looking for, right? Consent wise. But then how many times do you think you should check back in? So say you were drunk. This is what I see a lot. You were drunk and you were like, yeah, oh my God, I'd love to, right? We've all been there. And then you get deeper into the situation and you're like, oh my God, I really don't want to do this anymore. But it continues on and you don't say anything and they don't check back in. Well, I think the stat was something like, and I'm really quoting from the top of my head, so definitely 19% of men thought that because obviously we have to use sex segregated, we have to use the data has to be, with men and women, because obviously it doesn't really create a neutral response. So basically, like, men would say 19% of them said, yeah, we need to check back in. Only 19% thought they had to check back in for consent, moving through from what might have been a kiss to like full-blown penetration. And women, it was only 26%. So what I think we would see is, if we were teaching our children from the beginning around consent, and that's what I do with my children, is like really, really teaching them about consent, even to the point where one of my daughters comes home regularly and says, my friend keeps playing with my hair. And I say, that's not consensual. If you're saying you don't want her playing with your hair and you said no and she's continued on, then that's not getting, that's a consent issue. And so it's little things like that we don't think about, that I think if we did really think about, would help those kind of studies and that kind of actual real life situation that we live every day, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much, Naomi. This has been amazing. How can people work with you? What does your work look like with clients?
I brought the book out so that people could explore my work a little bit more and get my tone of voice. Because I always say to people, I'm a bit like Marmite. I'm like, you're either going to want to work with me or you're not. And you're going to be like, oh my God, yes, I need to work with Naomi. Or you're like, yeah, that's a bit much. So it kind of gives people those 5 steps that I believe are really important that we kind of touched on throughout. But what my favorite place to work with people is on a one-to-one. So I encourage people to come to me for 6 somatic sessions, either online or in person. I'm based in Margate in England, UK. Obviously, I'm very British. We could have told you that. But I'm in Margate, which is very easily accessible from London, for example. And I have clients from Manchester and Scotland. So it is accessible, but I know that not every week for 6 sessions. So we can mix and match. So that tends to happen, or they can come to me for a whole month's holding where we have like this really beautiful retreat day in my space. And we have this real beautiful like time together pre the retreat day. Then we have the retreat day, then we keep in touch for 2 weeks, and then we check back in with another session. That's really beautiful. And I also work with workshops. I teach Kundalini yoga here in Margate, and I sometimes go to festivals around the UK, so you might find me there's a few more coming up this year, so that's how you can work.
Amazing. Thank you so much. Is there anything else that you want to share?
No, this has been amazing, Megan. This has been a gift. I love chatting about it, and I feel really nourished. I feel like your questions were amazing, and I just felt really held in the space. So thanks, Megan.
Thank you. Thank you so much for sharing all of this wisdom with us, Naomi. I mean, I could talk about this topic for the rest of the day. It was like agonizing to try and keep it to an hour. So thank you so much. Well, I don't know about you ladies, but I'm in love. What a banging conversation. When Naomi said that she's like Marmite, I certainly know which side of the toast I land. For all women out there listening, I hope that you found this conversation enlightening and informative and see it as an invitation to connect more to your body. The more that I dive into this work for myself, the more I realise how poor our education has been around these topics. And the more that we educate and inform ourselves, the more we empower ourselves within our lives. As Naomi's book will tell you, through doing this work lies the keys to our happiness. All of Naomi's contact details are available within the show notes, and I encourage you to grab a copy of her amazing book. I always love to hear your feedback, so please feel free to hit me up on Instagram at higherlove_with_Megan or via my website, higher-love.com. I'd love to hear your takeaways from this episode. And if you enjoyed this conversation, please do share, rate, and send on to somebody else who would benefit from it. A big thanks to Naomi for sharing her wisdom, her story, and her vibes. I certainly came away from this conversation feeling reinvigorated, re-inspired, and re-empowered within these topics. A great conversation with an epic woman. Until next time, enjoy the summer sunshine and big love.